Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for taking the time to join our first Hangout of 2024. What a turnout. There are so many people here right now. We're at about 160 of you, so thank you for being here. I'm Larissa, and as of this year, I'm the TEDx Community Engagement Manager. While we might not have crossed paths yet, if you've attended any of our flagship events, we might have met there. I used to work on the events team. Either way, I'm looking forward to getting to know all of you. Before we dive in, I want to take a moment to acknowledge how special this community is, especially since we're celebrating 15 years of the TEDx program right now. Big round of applause on that to all of you. Each of you brings something unique, and together we're sharing ideas that can truly change the world. On that note, if you have a video you'd like to share with us about why you TEDx, and I see some of you here who have already submitted yours, there's still time. You'll find the link to submit yours in the chat, and we'll be collecting these to make our end of year video. Finally, I want to highlight something exciting coming up, our TEDx weekends. This year, there are two incredible events happening. TEDx Weekend Bangalore is coming up soon on October 5th to 6th in Bangalore, India. And TEDx Weekend Lagos is this November 8th to 10th in Lagos, Nigeria. It's an amazing chance for you and your team members to connect with fellow organizers, share ideas, and ultimately learn together. Tickets are still available, so remember to spread the word to your teams, please. Now, let's get into our theme, curation. As organizers, you're tasked with curating ideas that matter, and that often means facing tricky topics head-on. It's not always easy, but it's the heart of what makes TEDx so impactful. Today's Hangout is all about helping you face those challenges with confidence. Okay, I personally always like to know what's coming up, so I want to give you a little run through of how today's going to go. First, we'll have Ann Powers, our Associate Director of TEDx Programming and Publishing, in conversation with Kara Newman from the same team. Sharing their insights, they're going to help you sharpen your curation skills. Okay, this is going to be a big deep dive into the world of curation. They're going to be sharing a lot with you and pretty fast. Don't worry, we'll share all the resources they mentioned in the chat so you can come back to them later. We'll also post any links that we share in the Facebook group and the hub after this call, so you can always reference back. After that, we'll get some tips from TED's Senior Research Manager, Julia Dickerson, on how to work with speakers and handle fact-checking. As a note, this is a different Julia than the Julia answering questions in the chat. She's on our TEDx team. Finally, we'll wrap up with the Q&A where you can ask Ann and Kara all of your questions. We're going to have plenty of time for Q&A at the end, but feel free to pop your questions into the chat as we go, and we'll note them for the Q&A. Please keep in mind, we'll be giving extra preference to questions that are relevant to everyone on the call, or as many as possible. So try to shy away from questions that are specific to just your event. I'm really excited for us all to hear from Ann and Kara now. I'm going to jump off screen and hang out with y'all in the chat. With that, Ann, over to you.
Thank you, Larissa. As she said, we are very excited to be bringing back these community hangouts and the series as a whole this year. It's very hard to believe we're celebrating 15 years of the TEDx program, but whether you're new or if you've been organizing since the beginning, we do want to take the time to thank you all for that you do, to discover ideas that spark conversation, that deepen understanding, and that drive meaningful change in the world.
And for those that may know us or may not, we on the programming and publishing team are focused on spreading the incredible ideas from your events far and wide into the broader TED universe. We're also here to share our knowledge and resources back to you in the TEDx community. And today, we want you to walk away feeling empowered to and excited to curate in 3 important ways. 1, develop tangible and impactful talks about personal growth. 2, tackle rapidly evolving research on emerging science and health ideas. And 3, stage ideas that add to conversations about current events. But before we get started, we want to recommend a few past Hangouts focused on curation and fact-checking that we'll be building on today. We'll drop them in the chat, and we highly recommend that you bookmark them to watch them later if you haven't already. They come from TED's science curator, David Biello, research director, Nicole Bodie, and curation resources with us. So let's get started with Ann, who's going to discuss tips on building an idea-driven talk on personal growth and finding the right speakers for your event.
Thank you, Kara. So a lot of people think that TED Talks are motivational or perhaps driven by personal stories. These are very useful elements, but talks are ideas-first pieces of media. So selecting speakers begins with finding ideas first, not people, which we do cover in other resources. They will be linked in the chat. The main message here is that we encourage proactive speaker searches instead of nomination or application forms. This is really to ensure that the people who participate in your event both understand the TEDx ethos and the spirit of a TEDx talk. That is because depending solely on application forms to source ideas can lead to a very common dilemma for teams. We've seen this before. They end up sorting through a lot of personal growth adjacent pitches from either life coaches or keynote speakers. And often these individuals are more interested in using the stage to market themselves, or perhaps build upon their own brand, their own motivational speaking business, instead of building upon that larger idea. That said, some of our most popular talks tackle substantive ideas about personal growth, personal development, what the internet loves to call life hacks. These types of ideas can range from the very practical, like how to be a confident public speaker, or the poignant, like how to foster resilience after painful life experiences. But how do you ensure that ideas about personal growth are tangible and data-backed? This is where the proactive idea and speaker search plays a critical role. So this often means you want to speak seekers in a particular profession or field who can translate their broader work into actionable takeaways that anyone can apply to their own life. This is instead of speakers who might have very strong speaking skills, but maybe no unique idea at the heart of their talk. So I want to give an example. Let's say you're organizing a TEDx event at your university, and you want to curate a talk about personal growth and career development. We know from the news cycle that finding a job is very hard these days. Negotiating a fair wage is sometimes even harder. So you'd like to curate an idea that tackles confidence in the workplace and negotiation strategies. Not only could students in your audience utilize these tools post-graduation, but everyone online is looking for these hacks. A good place to start in this case is seeking organizational psychologists, HR professionals, career consultants, other workplace experts. Whether or not you select them as speakers, you can also interview them to learn more about their work and network further to find the right folks for your stage. I do want to note that this is not to say great ideas can only come from experts with advanced degrees. The key here is to identify people who can speak thoughtfully about career development instead of someone who might misuse the TEDx brand to speak about themselves under the guise of career development. So think about how you would describe this talk to a stranger. If you end up describing more about the speaker than a specific idea, like this person who runs a local charity, or this person who will share the success of their business coaching, that's usually a clue that you need to go back to the speaker and find their idea, not their identity, not their business. No matter what speaker search method you end up using, and no matter what the speaker's background or expertise is, a really simple but effective way to determine if their talk is idea-driven is by asking the speaker to write out this idea in a single sentence. Is the speaker going to share something you think audiences haven't heard before? Is it factual? Is it realistic? The most important question is it tangible? And if you answer no to any of these questions, or the idea is a vague description of motivating people to be more confident, your speaker needs to refine their idea a bit more. The best talks about personal growth are specific and evidence-based, but they're still very accessible to a wider audience. There can be a tendency for speakers to bring in evidence outside of their area of expertise to build their argument. But we know from experience that the strongest talks are speakers that stick to what they know and pull from sources that they know. You wouldn't expect an organizational psychologist, for instance, to be an expert in both neuroscience and quantum physics. So if they're pulling in those kinds of sources, I would be extra skeptical in this case. Some last thoughts. Transformational personal growth talks utilize a speaker's connection to their material and unique personal insight in service of that broader idea. I want to go back to a topic that I mentioned previously, and that is how to foster resilience after painful life experiences. Resilient psychologist Lucy Hone's talk, titled The 3 Secrets of Resilient People, is a really great example of leveraging both personal experience and research-backed insight in service of a broader idea about self-development. And that is to give viewers tools to cope with grief and flex their resiliency muscles. And we're going to play a short clip of that now to illustrate this.
These are my go-to strategies that I relied upon and saved me in my darkest days. So number 1, resilient people get that shit happens. They know that suffering is part of life. And knowing this stops you from feeling discriminated against when the tough times come. We seem to live in an age where we're entitled to a perfect life, where shiny, happy photos on Instagram are the norm, when actually the very opposite is true. Number 2, resilient people are really good at choosing carefully where they select their attention. As humans, we are really good at noticing threats and weaknesses. Our stress response is permanently dialed up. Resilient people don't diminish the negative, but they also have worked out a way of tuning into the good.
So what makes this talk stand out is not just Lucy's stage presence and speaking ability, which is absolutely commendable. It's her powerful personal story of hardship after losing her daughter, combined with her work in psychology and resilience research. And it's really the synthesis of these 3 elements that makes the ultimate idea that there are 3 tools that any person can use to become more resilient, both credible and accessible, which is really the mark of a mainstay TEDx talk.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this idea-first approach can build great talks across all kinds of topics. But I do want to make one important point about actionable tips for science and health. One thing that we really shouldn't do in TEDx talks is offer prescriptive advice on ways to specifically treat mental and physical health conditions, because as much as audiences crave this content, it can get really stigmatizing and misinformative quickly. And medicine is highly personalized. What works for one person isn't guaranteed to work for another, let alone the 42 million subscribers on the TEDx YouTube channel. But with that being said, science is still a critical part of the TED universe, and there's so much fun that can be had in curating these topics. We want you to feel really excited to empower your community with great science that helps them better understand themselves and the world around them. But whether it's AI, climate tech, or genetic diseases, what we knew 10 years ago can be really different from what we know today, or what's maybe coming up 10 years in the future. This can make curation and fact-checking really difficult, even for experts. But remember, you don't have to do it alone. We have plenty of great resources, which we'll link in the chat, that can help you with science curation. And be sure to lean into the brain trust that you develop, other scientists in your community or enthusiasts who are part of your organizing team. There's no substitute, though, for making sure that your speakers and team members all really clearly understand and agree to the content guidelines and expectations set up in the fact-checking guide. So to start, when you're thinking about science curation, get a clear picture of the topics you want to curate around, their surrounding context, and the intention of the speaker you want to invite. Read about what's going on locally and globally, and consider what unique perspective your event or community really brings to that topic. And ask questions that help you stress test and look at the talk, an idea from multiple angles. Like, what's a controversy in this field that a general audience would understand? The speaker's relationship to the material is always important, but especially for science topics. So great candidates could be a faculty member or grad student who's doing amazing original research on fungi at a local university, or a science journalist or great educator who's written a lot about astrophysics in an exciting and engaging way for reputable publications. The closer they are to that original material, the better. But just because you've chosen somebody who's an expert doesn't mean they don't need to be fact-checked. Keep an eye out for anybody who's been drawing a lot of criticism for overpromising their results, and be mindful of what you include in a talk as evidence to build up that idea. A good science speaker should really be able to tell you clearly and accurately where their claims are coming from, and responsibly distinguish between where the idea is right now and where they hope it's going to go in the future. You can use secondary sources like books, blog posts, and Wikipedia articles to give you like a little summary of what's going on in a topic, but do watch out because those can often insert errors. So you'll want to also ask speakers for primary sources like peer-reviewed research studies too. If a speaker can only pull from their own personal experiences, or they want to focus on things that they've experimented with just by themselves, rather than what's actually been tested and verified by other scientists, this is a red flag, especially on anything to do with health. But if you don't have a background in science, how would you even get started looking at this stuff? You can ask the speaker for that reference list and list of studies that they want to focus on, and ask them to help explain it to you in easy to understand terms. You can rely on fact checkers and experts to still read those sources and ask speakers for direct quotes in those sources that support those claims. And then you can think about the best way to present those findings. So let's say you have a speaker you're interested in who's been doing some research on anti-aging medications. But when you read their paper, you find out it was actually only done in like 12 male monkeys and there was no control group, which would make it really difficult to think about how this is actually going to work in humans. It could still be really interesting research, but you'll want the script to reflect this and keep asking the speaker some more questions. And remember, a strong idea takes into account at least some of its own weaknesses to provide an honest representation of that idea. This is the best way to answer questions because if the speaker doesn't do it in the talk, others might do it in the comment section for them. Then, based on the strength and content of a source, you can think about language, which is arguably the most important part of responsible science communication. Speakers might think that they have to sensationalize, oversimplify, or overpromise to make science feel exciting and relevant to general audiences, but that's not necessarily the case, and it can actually end up hurting a talk in the long run. So let's take a quick look at a clip from an example talk by Kathleen McAuliffe, who's a journalist who breaks down the microbiome and related health research. We'll play that clip for you right now.
A rapidly advancing treatment for mental disturbances is called vagus nerve stimulation, or VNS. VNS strengthens the gut barrier, preventing pathogenic bacteria from breaching it and causing an inflammatory response that spreads to the brain. Encouragingly, the FDA has already approved VNS for the treatment of severe epilepsy and depression unresponsive to standard therapy. Of course, it's early days. We don't yet know whether successful treatments will emerge from this line of research, but I think you'll agree there's cause for optimism.
Now, there's a lot of science in there and a lot of buzz online about the topics that Kathleen just mentioned, and it can be difficult to know what sources to trust. But one thing that Kathleen does really well in here is she avoids jumping to really big conclusions, offering really specific hacks or prescriptive advice, or claiming this new therapy is going to work for everybody. Instead, she balances that hope and hype really honestly, sticking to credible research about the therapies that have actually been FDA approved, and talks about what more work actually does need to get done, so audiences still feel curious and excited. Another difficult to approach topic with a lot of popular interest that we've been getting a lot lately is psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies for mental health treatments. This is especially difficult to curate around because there are ethical and safety concerns, frequent updates to research, it's regulated in different ways around the world, and there's a close link to religious and cultural traditions. Talks on this topic should be very carefully and objectively framed, and never endorse or sensationalize psychedelic use based on personal stories or individual experiences. One fairly nuanced angle comes from Benjamin Lewis's TEDx Salt Lake City talk. We don't have time to play it, but we'll drop it in the chat for you to watch later. This speaker is coming from an accredited clinical research setting, and he works on psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. He asks a really specific question on the best way to set up the therapy environment, and uses really careful language to report his findings from his own published study, explaining how it was designed and what its limitations are. And he also acknowledges that there are some important safety risks and doesn't endorse using them outside of clinical settings. To summarize, though, great science is all about asking questions and staying curious. So if speakers are claiming to have all the answers, a revolutionary new solution, or universal cure, and they aren't open to talking about those limitations, these are the red flags to look out for. This could look like really sweeping phrases saying, there's no side effects or harms for this therapy, or everybody in the world experiences this universally. Speakers also might use vague language saying, science says or research shows. You really want to ask what science and what research. And as we said earlier, speakers shouldn't promote ways to broadly treat, prevent, and reverse mental or physical health conditions, because it's irresponsible and unsafe for us to offer them on the TEDx stage and for YouTube audiences, even if the speaker is a medical professional. Instead, dream big and think about big picture takeaways that everyone could find value in, regardless of their own specific health or medical status. And a lot of these lessons and thoughtful takeaways and language also translate over well to our next topic, which is current events.
Thank you, Kara. You're very right. Successfully curating complicated subject matter often comes down to language choice, and that includes curating around current events. Now, I will say that typically evergreen talks are the ones that our viewers engage with most. These are ideas that resonate year over year. They still have an impact on our channel, even a decade after publishing. You can think about talks like Mel Robbins' How to Stop Screwing Yourself Over, or Mariana Atencio's What Makes You Special. We'll link those talks in the chat. On the other hand, we exist in a rapidly changing world with fast-moving media cycles, and current events are really an unavoidable part of everyday life. That said, impactful ideas necessarily include ideas that add to global conversations about these current events. It could be politics, democracy, geopolitical conflict, social justice, civil rights, the list really goes on. But whether you're curating for a democracy salon, a countdown event, or even a youth event at your high school, the key to curating an idea about a current event is finding that connective tissue within it. In other words, great current events talks find ways to connect topical conversations to a bigger idea that's still going to resonate after that media cycle concludes.
One example of a talk that actually does this pretty well, talking about current events without taking a political stance, comes from Tom Teves, which we'll link in the chat. Tom is a father who lost his son to a mass shooting in the United States, and gun violence and gun control specifically can often become really politically divisive. We even outline it as a topic to approach with caution in our content guidelines. But Tom's talk takes a unique angle. He has a very powerful personal story that he combines with research-backed takeaways from media organizations and psychologists about ways to change how we report on gun violence in order to reduce it in the future. And regardless of their personal opinions, viewers walk away feeling like they can take action that isn't tied to political parties, specific legislation, or the endorsement of one organization or candidate. And importantly, the talk isn't dependent on the news cycle. Tom creates this really connective tissue so that the takeaways really remain evergreen.
That's a great point. I also want to say that curating ideas about current events that can remain evergreen is important on a very practical level. And that is, TEDx doesn't function like a traditional news or media outlet. So from the time your event occurs to when you upload that talk and we publish it on our channel, the information about that event, whether it's a geopolitical conflict, some kind of political or civil rights movement, has likely evolved from when you first invited that speaker to your event. So creating that connective tissue, that connection to a broader idea, that's going to ensure that the speaker's idea isn't dated by the time the internet sees it. Also, the same three curation principles that we've discussed earlier apply to curating for current events. And that is, one, you want to pick a speaker with the right qualifications and background. Two, you want to make sure that this is someone who can give a nuanced and respectful take. And three, you want to carefully fact check that talk all along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Anne said, great talks happen when speakers have that expertise, consideration for multiple perspectives, and a unique insight that maybe the average person doesn't have. This could be a law professor like Cesar Cotomic Garcia Hernandez, which we'll link in the chat, who gave a talk about improving legal support for immigrants and asylum seekers. Other unique ideas might come from a journalist who has ideas about discussing more empathetic war reporting, or a software developer who built an algorithm to create more fair and unbiased election maps. This can keep the talk focused on ideas that transcend partisan politics and create content that bridges rather than divides. There can also be potential for misinformation around current events. What makes for a great headline in the New York Times won't translate seamlessly into a TEDx talk. So if you do end up referencing a specific piece of news, be mindful of how many details are actually relevant to that broader idea, and carefully collect links to fact check those details, including the ones about personal information. We love to use collaborative tools like Google Docs that help us keep track of dated comments so that you can go back to those original materials to revisit them in case events change or sources get modified. One other really important point to keep in mind is that your speaker might want to focus on real-world examples from legal cases or legislative successes. But remember, these should focus on supporting the broader idea and not contributing to a political or legal agenda. In other words, the TEDx stage shouldn't be focusing on presenting a legal argument or promoting legislation, especially if they're ongoing or details can't really be easily confirmed. And we do want to mention at the end of this little chat that we have a wonderful new resource which Sierra is going to drop in, and it is called the TEDx Accuracy Review Checklist. This is actually based on a tool that TED's research team uses to work with speakers on all types of talks throughout the curation process to keep track of fact-checking expectations in a very clear way, all the way from when you're first developing the idea until the talk gets staged and recorded.
The last thing we want to say, I know we've been talking for a while, is that it might be that a talk works really well in the context of your event. It brings people together to have a great in-person conversation, but maybe you realize later on that it doesn't translate as well into a piece of digital media for the internet to see. That is completely okay. If a talk ends up not following our content guidelines, or the copyright rules, or even YouTube's community guidelines, organizers do ultimately have the discretion to withhold a talk. You can also reach out to us and we'll brainstorm publishing strategies with your team. So if you have any additional questions or need support, we're here for you. Write into us at TEDx@TED.com.
Ann and Kara also put together a brand new fact-checking tips page that we'll send in the chat that you can reference, share with your teams, have a read through when you're looking for some inspiration. It does have a little blurb on our guidance on using AI, which is new, and some really useful info there. All right, I'm sure you have plenty of questions coming up. I've been watching them come through the chat coming through the chat and noting them as well. Remember to put them in the chat. We're going to keep an eye on them. We'll circle back on that shortly for the Q&A. But up next, we have Julia Dickerson, who works on the TED team fact-checking the talks you know and love on TED.com. Julia really wanted to be here with us live today, but she's incredibly busy in the world of fact-checking. She was generous enough, though, to put together this video for us with her top tips. So on that note, let's take a look and watch this video from the one, the only, the pre-recorded Julia Dickerson.
Hi everyone, I hope you're having a good hangout so far. My name is Julia Dickerson, and I am the Senior Research Manager here at TED. So I oversee fact-checking for our non-TEDx events and for our podcasts. I'm going to go over a little bit of how we fact-check for these events and these shows, as well as some tips for working with speakers. The very first step is requesting an annotated script with sources from your speaker. They should include sourcing for all information they share, so numbers, dates, historical references, scientific claims, theories, etc. There are two reasons why this is helpful. So one, it provides you with the information you need up front for when you're doing your fact check. And two, it encourages speakers to develop their talks with fact checking at the forefront, rather than as an afterthought. So this is similar to how in academia you would conduct a literature review before writing a paper, so that you build your article around the existing research, rather than writing your article and then searching for sources to back it up. Next step is to review their script. So going through, verifying what you can with the sources they provided. I also flag any sections that either don't have sourcing but need it, or where the sourcing is insufficient to support their claims, places I think could benefit from an edit, or where I'm just unsure and want to chat with the speaker to see if they can provide clarification. From there, the speaker gets back to us. So they might provide us with further sourcing or agree to some edits. Then we go back to step 2, where we review their responses. I might have to repeat this process a few times before I feel a talk is actually ready for the stage. Once I finish my review, I either mark the talk as good to go for the event, or if there are some things I couldn't resolve with the speaker beforehand, maybe because we couldn't agree on an edit or the sourcing was really dense, I make a note of it so that we can continue working on it after their talk is given. Then they deliver their talk. Once they do, I then compare what they said on stage to the fact-checked version of their talk to see if there were any misspeaks or added lines that either need to be addressed with an edit or fact-checked again. After that, I summarize my notes and request edits or footnotes if need be. This is an important step, especially for TEDx events, where you may be asked by your TEDx fact checkers to provide more information many months after an event has finished. So that is the overall process, but I understand that fact checking can be intimidating to do, especially if you feel like you're dealing with experts in a field that you know nothing about. So the first step, which I encourage you to do at the very beginning of your work with a speaker, is to explain to them what is expected in the fact-checking process. This includes going over TEDx's publishing standards and informing them what is needed on their end. When speakers understand from the very beginning that someone will be asking them questions, potentially suggesting edits, and that this is a standard process that ultimately increases their chances of having their talk published, it can make the process feel more neutral and less like an attack on them, and provide incentive to collaborate with you. Still, it's really easy for a fact checker to sound dismissive, and really easy for a speaker to get defensive. So in my years fact checking at TED, I've worked with hundreds of speakers, and I found that the experience can be made a lot better by taking an approach that is direct but open-minded, and with curiosity at the forefront. For example, if you've received a source from a speaker, and you're not quite sure that it actually supports what they're saying, but you're worried that by asking them for more sources or suggesting an edit, you're being dismissive of their expertise. I like to follow a kind of formula where I thank them for their source, I briefly explain what I've seen in their source or in other sources, and then ask them for their thoughts and provide options. For example, let's say a speaker says something like, anxiety rates in young people have risen globally. And they send you a link to a CDC article describing how anxiety diagnoses in children have increased in the US over the years. First, CDC, Center for Disease Control, that's a great source. But you notice when you read through it that CDC source supports what they're saying, but it only mentions the US. And they're saying it increased globally. So then you maybe look up more sources and you see a World Health Organization report that says in some countries, rates have actually declined or stayed stable. So the way I might phrase this to a speaker is I might say, thank you so much for sending us the CDC report. I'm seeing that rates in the US have increased, but that some countries have actually seen decreases, as described in this WHO report. If that looks right to you, would you be open to either of the following small edits or something similar? Or could you clarify if there is data showing an increase globally? And then I would provide them with an option that could correct it, that says anxiety rates in young people have risen in the US. So this approach shows that you're engaging with their material, it prevents what you found, you offer solutions, but importantly, you show that you're open to hearing their response. So hopefully this way of thinking about fact-checking and engaging with speakers helps make it a more productive process. But what if it just doesn't go well? What if a speaker doesn't want to accept your notes or is not willing to provide sources or edit their script? Maybe they don't accept that line you just offered them. It happens. In those instances, I think it's helpful to reiterate our guidelines and the options we have after the event. This is where I think it's important to remind yourself of a few things. First, everyone makes mistakes, and it's okay. Fact-checking typically isn't about catching someone lying or purposefully sharing misinformation. It's often smaller discrepancies made in good faith. Very rarely do I find a script that does not contain an error at some level, even for some of the most qualified and established speakers. By having a fact-checker like you or someone you've hired for the event take a second look, we can strengthen a talk by preventing accidental errors or having the speaker address potential weak points. We can also protect our speakers, so nobody is immune from making mistakes. It is so easy to misread an article or switch around some numbers unintentionally, and it's not a reflection of their level of expertise, competence, or intellect. In fact, I've found that sometimes the longer a speaker has been studying a topic or presenting their research, they can be more vulnerable to these kinds of mistakes. For instance, they can end up relying on information that was accurate when they first encountered it, but maybe now it's outdated, or maybe it's even been debunked. Maybe they've been repeating a claim that they're confident about, but if they looked at the sourcing with fresh eyes, they think it's questionable. This is where it's really important to remember that fact-checking is collaborative. It's a partnership with the speaker, and it's not in opposition to them. So it's okay to ask questions. That's how ideas and talks are refined. It's how we can protect our audience from potentially misleading information and our speakers from unwanted criticism. So that is all from me. In summary, set expectations with your speakers early about what is needed for fact check before and after the event. It's okay to ask your speakers questions, even if you don't feel qualified. The whole process is collaborative, and ultimately it strengthens the talk. When communicating with speakers, be direct but curious. Keep fact-checking notes so you can submit them to our team when the time comes. And take advantage of all the resources our extraordinary TEDx team has put together for you, like the fact-checking checklist and an example fact check. And of course, enjoy all the learning you'll do during this process. TEDx talks cover all sorts of topics, and you'll learn so much through the fact-checking process.
Jennifer asks, where can we find criticisms of info shared by our speakers?
Oh, that's a great question. There is so much information online, and if the speaker is just giving you their own sources and you're trusting them on that, it can be tough to get a full big picture of what actually is going on in the field. This is actually, I don't recommend AI often, but this is one case where AI can be helpful if you pick the right search engine tool to maybe get a summary of a topic. You could, if you find a really good AI tool that cites original sources, that gives you links to where you can get more information on something, you could maybe say, hey, what's a criticism of this general type of field? Or, what are some controversies that are going on? And look into maybe other things that have been published maybe more recently if a speaker is sending you a lot of information that's really from far back. Say, if they're wanting to give you information from like the 1990s, that's not going to be as relevant as something that's coming from the 2010s and the 2020s. So be mindful of those types of sources that you're getting. And then I'd say the other thing to look out for is we have a lot of really great resources in the checklist and in our fact-checking guide that kind of explains, looking at primary sources and that peer-reviewed research and maybe summaries of those peer-reviewed research versus like looking at just websites. If they're just sending you, maybe blog posts or things from their own sources, that's a sign that you really want to dig a little bit deeper and get a bigger picture of what's going on in the field of research.
I think on that note, Kara, I'm going to actually stick with you for a second here then, because we had Mark from TEDx Santa Barbara ask a related question. So his question is, when you have citable sources, do they need to be put on a slide shown during the talk or in a file that can be sent on request? What can you share about that?
That's a great question. I think if you're spending too much time on your slides, just giving all this really dense information, it can really make the talk feel bogged down a bit. But you could still include like a little small reference at the bottom of each slide, because that might be also really helpful for your team to keep track of fact checking. But I'd say the best way to do it is sort of what Julia recommended, which is working on developing that kind of annotated script. So you have a doc that's giving you links to really specific sources and clips from those sources that are supporting the speaker's points. So I'd say that's probably the best place to house all of your fact-checking information.
Fabulous. And I have potentially a softball question here for you from an ask. Is it appropriate to request a review of the talk before it's delivered? I'm assuming that means from our team.
That is a good question. It is almost impossible for our team to review a talk before it's been delivered because really we're concerned with that piece of digital media, what the speaker says on stage and what's recorded. That said, in the speaker preparation process, you should have a script. Once that script is finalized, if you want a gut check from our team, you can always share that script by writing into TEDx@TED.com, highlighting any potential concerns you might have. And we can provide insight and advice, but ultimately we know this happens all the time. What a speaker has in their script is usually a bit different from what ends up happening on stage. So it's really not until the talk is recorded and delivered to our team as a file that we can fully review and approve it. But we do have teams writing in all the time with scripts just to get a gut check. So if you feel you need that, please write into us.
I wanna stick with the theme of citing sources right now, because we had a lot of questions come up from the chat. And I think one from Izdahar from TEDx Huntington Beach that came up that I saw elsewhere as well is how can you be sure that the statistics submitted from sources are accepted by TED, first off? And second off, do you have any advice? Is there a particular link that shows the sources that TED accepts as credible? What can we look at there?
That is a great question. I wish there was just like a perfect database that we could give you all of your great information to like harvest and pick those great, sources right out of. But it could be super tough because there's so much online again. And like I mentioned earlier, information evolves really, really fast. And, what was true, 10 years ago, it's different from maybe what's true right now. But we do have some really great resources, particularly if you're thinking about science that can point you to great reputable journals. David Biello's Hangouts, which we linked earlier, are really, really great. They talk about some of the most reputable journals to be looking at if you're looking for science. But overall, I think a good rule of thumb is looking for primary sources, right? So this might look like official announcement from government organizations. In the US, we think a lot about, the CDC is the Center for Disease Control. So if we're looking for like really good vetted information about public health, oftentimes we'll look there. Maybe the World Health Organization if we're looking for broad, information about health. If we're wanting to look at maybe stuff for other countries, more specifically like NHS in the UK might be a good source to get a general overview on a topic. You'll want to maybe be looking at, specific places where that information all originated from, or sources that can link you back to where they got that information clearly. And I would say a lot of that stuff on tips is actually in our fact-checking guide and that checklist that we gave you. That checklist actually shows you how to kind of like ask questions for a speaker and see if they can actually explain to you, how was this study really designed? And can we actually make those conclusions based on the study that you gave us, right? Like I mentioned earlier, I think, sometimes you're getting studies that are based on a really small sample size, or they actually haven't compared, with a group that has like a different treatment. So you can't establish that same relationship. Be sure to just ask a lot of questions of your speakers, I think, as you're getting those sources. And that's always a really, really good place to kind of start when you're looking at a lot of that information.
Thanks, Kara. I want to switch right now to talk about the youth events for a second, because we had a number of questions come up about them. I know it's a little bit of a specific case, but I think it'll help shed some light on tricky cases that we get. So we had both Rena and Christelle say in the chat, I'm currently organizing youth event at my school. It's hard to find students that are the experts in a specific topic. Can you recommend some ways to find speakers? I also want to mention the other question right now because it seems very related. How can we apply the criteria you mentioned today to TEDx youth speakers? So how do we rely on youth speakers there? Anne, I think I'm going to toss this over to you.
Yeah, I think, Kara, let's tag team this one because we both have our own insight here. That is a really good question because when you're curating youth speakers, they're students. They aren't experts. They don't have advanced degrees. They haven't conducted, or they likely haven't conducted original research, etc. It is going to be, you're going to focus much more on what a student is interested in, what a student maybe has been learning about in school. The guardrails you want to put up, like we went through this whole criteria for seeking speakers and seeking ideas. With youth speakers, it's more about putting up guardrails. It is really difficult to put a youth speaker on stage and ask them to offer advice about, as Kara said, health conditions, to make sweeping claims that they don't really have experience with. You're going to lean more into their personal experiences and personal story without pairing that with really stigmatizing or sensationalized statements or ideas. And this is really critical when it comes to science, health, and tech in particular. So Kara, I don't know if you want to add to that, but this is where we see the most issues with youth speakers.
Yeah, and I think one thing also to think about when you're curating youth speakers for your event is you want to get them feeling really excited about all of these concepts and ideas and give them the opportunity to maybe do a deep dive into what's going on into that field on their own, right? And encourage them to think about the scientific method and get excited about ideas that they can share. So maybe you could try applying that type of lens, giving them sort of an outline. If you find, we actually may link to this in some of our resources, but we can also share a link with you all later, a very, very specific source, but just to show youth speakers and get in the mindset of how to think like a scientist, how to answer these questions in a really kind of thoughtful way. And that can even be a really great exercise in them sort of developing some of those ideas. But maybe even if they're curating about, say a current events topic and they want to talk about something that's really relevant to them, they can connect some of their own personal story to that, but then, get them thinking through maybe some resources that can help them identify media literacy skills. Is this number just coming from one place, or are they used to looking at sources that are maybe reporting on things from multiple perspectives? I think this can be a really great educational opportunity for youth speakers to still think really critically and feel engaged without, say, claiming, that they're the #1 expert on a certain topic.
Thank you both. I have a question. Kara, I think it might be for you, but I'm going to let you both decide here from Caleb. To me, it's about how to handle bias and promotional pieces. Yes. What should we do when the expertise of a speaker borders on marketing the actual work or medical treatment that they're referencing? A lot of speakers who speak at TEDx events do original research and at the same time are working on patents for those things. What are your thoughts here? What's the scientific advice?
That is a very good question. And you may even have some angles about, promotional things. But I think a lot of this really comes in to that very early time when you're inviting a speaker to come speak at your event and making sure that, you're getting a very clear intention of why they're coming to give a talk. Are they coming to educate and get people interested and curious about an idea, or do they want to come on stage to promote their own really specific work? And can you get that separate idea separated from their own, plugging their own work? I think also even looking at the sources they're giving you, if they're only coming from the speaker's personal website, maybe it's like affiliated with their business and they're only studies that this business has conducted, but other people that are also working in the field haven't really looked into that or weighed in on how things are actually working. That can be a sign that they're maybe more motivated by promoting, a specific agenda related to their company rather than, study things that have been published in peer-reviewed research. And I also realized I didn't actually name like really good journals that you can look into, which David Bielo does in his Hangout. But sources that we really love are like the Public Library of Online Science, which is PLOS. Nature is like a very big journal, and they actually have a lot of really great secondary reporting on their major studies. So they give really good summaries of what's going on in these topics. So you don't have to read that whole really dense paper to know what's going on. And the journal Science is also another really great one to kind of see what's going on. But yeah, I think in terms of handling bias specifically, looking at who is actually coming up with this work, have other people besides the speaker been talking about this idea, and do they kind of provide a little bit more of a holistic view of what's actually going on?
And I'll add to that. I think, in the TED universe, there are plenty of speakers who have developed a life-changing device or method for something, and it is close to their hearts and part of their business. If they're delivering that on the stage and it feels like an ad or not an advertisement, it usually is. What takes a speaker away from just marketing their own products on the stage is kind of opening up the conversation, making it a little bit broader. So if there is an issue that they have spent their life trying to solve, talk about that issue, their solution, and the many other solutions that have been researched or thought of. You want to expand that conversation beyond that very specific solution or device or product that they might have. And just simple practical things that will keep the talk from feeling like an advertisement or a promotional situation is just like avoiding lots of logos, avoiding lots of name drops. If they're describing their talk in one sentence and all they're talking about is this life-changing device that they've created, you're going to have to work with that speaker very closely to develop a script that doesn't feel promotional. But TED, we have talks like this all the time, and they can be done successfully. And I'll just plug this again. If you are having issues with this in your speaker prep process and you want to share a script with us, please write in and share that script. We are more than happy to offer our own insight and advice and hopefully shape that idea to be something great.
Thank you both. I'm so sad to say, but looking at the time, I think we really only have time left for one more question here. I want it to be a point of clarification from Julia's video because I saw it come up in the chat a couple of times. So if either of you know. In her video, Julia mentioned something about fact checking after the talk has been presented. Gail's question in the chat was around editing the video and fact checking after the talk's been presented. So can you just walk through that process for a second? How can people do this? How important is fact checking after the talk has been presented?
Kara, maybe you want to take a stab at that. I'll just say up top that fact checking is a part of every step of the process, from the time you find an idea, select your speakers, stage them, and then the post-production process. So you do want to fact check after the talk has been delivered and when you're in that editing phase, because as we noted previously, what your speaker script is and what they deliver on stage tends to be, at least at the very least, a little bit different. There are going to be discrepancies, and it's really in the editing process that you can fix some of those fact-checking issues if you do identify them. But Kara, over to you for other specifics.
Yeah, definitely. I think what that can look like in, the process of after you've recorded the video, let's say maybe a speaker goes off script and actually makes a really, explicit claim, that's saying, this has no side effects, like that thing that I'd said earlier. And you're like, wait, actually, we talked about that. Don't say that in the talk. And you can work on maybe cutting a small line out, or maybe they used a statistic and they just kind of completely went off script there at certain points. You can make small tweaks to the video to, clear it up and make sure that it feels accurate when you're actually uploading it to us. But I think she also could refer to, if the talk gets uploaded and for some reason we're asking you for some more information about it. We're saying, hey, you curated this like really interesting new field of science that we haven't even heard of. Can you give us some more information about this? You're ready to go with like all of the notes on your fact check that you've done. You've got all these really great references. You can send it to us and say, yeah, we did a ton of great work on this. And like, this is all the information. It's really backed up. Or, we did do all of this work on it, but there were actually a few points that we weren't as sure about. And we'd love to get your thoughts on maybe different ways that we can make this work as a piece of digital media. Maybe that might look like we add a little kind of disclaimer, like, don't look to this talk for health or medical advice, because that's not really responsible to do in a talk. Or maybe we add in maybe a footnote linking to a source that's going to work really well. So I think for that kind of goes into kind of the broader strategy about bigger media for publishing the talk that we're always here to help and collaborate on too.
Big thank you to Anne, Kara, and Julia Dickerson for sharing their expertise. And a big thank you to Will for hopping in on the chat and being with you all today, and for Sierra and Julia for answering all your questions there too. To all of you, a big thank you for spending your day with us and joining today's Hangout. We will be having more this year. Keep an eye out on your inbox for more info on that. It's been a really fantastic session. I hope you're leaving with some great insights and ideas to bring back to your teams. Can't wait to see you all at the next one. Have a great day. Bye.